is Camus Pilling, and this is my Biology 220 report, or presentation, I guess, and I'm doing mine on anthrax. So the disease anthrax, the scientific name is your Bacillus anthracis. It is zoonotic disease, meaning obviously that the disease originates in animals and then is passed to humans, but it is not contagious, so it cannot be passed from, human to human. In that way, it is considered a Category A disease, meaning it is considered some of the most dangerous because it has a huge potential to really disrupt civilian populations and do a lot of harm in them. The physical structure of the anthrax or Bacillus anthracis, they are gram-positive rod-shaped bacteria. They are aerobic and spore-forming as well. They're non-hemolytic and they are non-motile. So what makes this Category A is that it has 3 toxin components that make them so lethal. But together they are not, if you separate these toxic components, they are actually not toxic in and of themselves, but put them together and they are. Those 3 are protective antigen, your edema factor, and your lethal factor. So your protective antigen is the binding subunit which allows the entry of the edema factor. Your edema factor increases your CAMP, which your cyclic adenosine monophosphate, which impairs the neutrophil and macrophage function, and that inhibits their ability to engulf the bacteria and phagocytize it, and causes massive edema in your body. And then the third one is the lethal factor. So the lethal factor is a zinc metalloprotease that inactivates the protein kinase, and it stimulates the macrophage to release tumor necrosis factor alpha and interleukins. Anthrax is unique because one of the only bacteria with a capsule composed of a protein, and this specific protein is called your polyglutamyl protein. So the spore for anthrax is also a very hardy spore. It's very resistant to your drying heat, UV light, and disinfectants, and it can survive dormant for long periods of time. So the spores can only be activated when they are introduced into the host and have the host's materials, and they are very easily inhaled because the spores are so small, only about 1 to 5 microns in diameter. So what exactly this disease is it is hemorrhagic mediastinitis, which is bleeding into the space surrounding the heart and your greater blood vessels. But it has many ones, so that's one. And then you can have, your respiratory failure from acute respiratory distress syndrome, and that when your lungs are leaking and so they fill up with water and cannot absorb oxygen. You can have circulatory failure, which leads to shock or low blood pressure. And then, in only about half the patients, but still happens about half, is you can get meningitis from it as well. So you do have antibiotics and I guess you could say a cure, kind of, and prevention for anthrax. So here are I won't necessarily go through them, but here are the specific antibiotics that you can take to prevent it and try to minimize the effects of anthrax in your body. And then these 2 are favored, obviously it says right here, for post-exposure. So if you want to, along with your vaccine, this makes you less likely to be so susceptible to the anthrax disease. So the vaccine is a killed vaccine made from your cell-free filtrate of non-encapsulated attenuated strain of the anthrax. It contains no dead or alive bacteria, so it's safe for humans. However, animals are vaccinated with the living cultures, but it's obviously considered, it's more effective, but it's considered too dangerous for human use. And then testing for anthrax, They have a few different tests, but one of the most promising ones, it says, is a newly developed nasal swab, which can detect as little as 3 spores, and that will obviously tell you if you have the disease or not. So how can you develop anthrax? So obviously, as I said before, it is a zoonotic disease, so it originates in animals when they, ingest it somehow and it gets activated within their systems. So this is specific in your domestic and wild animals like your cattle, sheep, goats, and those kind, and they can get it easily because obviously they're herbivores, and they can get it from the contaminated water or soil or grass, and anything they can eat really can be contaminated. So they become activated obviously when they get into the body, and that's when they start producing the toxins. So you have 4 different methods of contracting anthrax. The first one is called cutaneous anthrax, which is the most common, and that's when it gets into your skin, whether you have an abrasion or a cut or something. And it is considered to be the least dangerous. Infection usually develops 1 to 7 days after your exposure. The exotoxin causes localized tissue necrosis, which develops into black lesions, which is luckily painless. It just looks really bad. Those are called your malignant pustules. And luckily, also the skin lesion usually takes care of itself through your body's natural mechanisms, but it can develop into severe skin edema and shock can occur. And then this little part right here is just showing you how easy it is to acquire it, which is why it's the most common, your infectious dose and such things compared to the other ones. Your second one is inhalation. So you have this little picture right here. Obviously, you inhale the spores, and because they're so small, they can get right into your little bronchioles and aeoles. Is everyone? So it's the most deadly, and the infection develops usually within the week after exposure. They're taken into the lungs, and then they reproduce in your lymph nodes. You have your gastrointestinal anthrax, which is your most rare, and that's obviously when you're ingested it and it replicates in your intestines and it releases their exotoxins and makes kind of the same lesions that were on your skin and cutaneous in your intestines. That's very, very bad. Your last one is injection, which, like it says here, has never been reported. That's more of a bioterrorism part of it. So as part of the little history of it, here is your wins. The first clinical descriptions were given in, 1752. It's been worked with by a lot of famous scientists such as Koch and Louis Pasteur. And then in 1944 was the first vaccine created, or vaccine-like, or sorry, not vaccine, the first drug to treat it. And then 1950s was the first vaccine for humans. And then anthrax is interesting because it has a long history of bioterrorism because it is so easily spread and so easily ingested into large populations that it was used in World War I. There's been things that it was used by the Germans in World War II, and even some cases in the United States as early as 2001 and another one in 2010 where it has been spread and has caused a lot of fear because it is so dangerous and can be spread so fast. More into the history as, where did this develop? I think this is the most interesting part. So it's thought to originated in Egypt, and a lot of historians and scientists actually think that it may have been the 5th plague in Moses' 10 plagues of Egypt, and in the 5th plague it says that all the horses, cattle, sheep, and everything died from this, and so they think that's a very strong possibility of what it could be. And it is mostly common in developing areas where they don't have a lot of veterinary public health programs, where the animals are treated and taken care of.